G'day and welcome back to The Shed. Today we go back to 1989 and we'll take a look at Elizabeth Anne Scarborough's The Healer's War. So what I'd like to do, as always, is provide a spoiler-free plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, I'll make some recommendations. I'll put this one to the memory test and we'll rank it on our ever-growing Sci-Fi Shed ladder, where I've been ranking all the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels. So many of you may be familiar with Elizabeth Anne Scarborough because she's a very prolific fantasy writer. She's been writing, or at least publishing, a novel a year since 1986. So she's got a whole lot of novels out there, and she's also collaborated with Anne McCaffrey. So she's really highly, honoured and respected science fiction and fantasy author. But she's also a registered nurse and a Vietnam war veteran. So she served in Vietnam as a registered nurse. And this sort of novel, in many ways, is almost autobiographical in some ways. I'm not read it anywhere that she sort of refers to it as such, but I do see that there's a lot of her real life in this novel. So when it comes to the plot, we have this Lieutenant Kitty, what's her name? Lieutenant Kitty McCulley, and she's a registered nurse, and she's just been transferred to a different hospital because she's accidentally killed this child by overdose. It was an accident. So she's already feeling absolutely terrible about herself. But in a new hospital, they're also treating Vietnamese civilians that have been injured in the war, as well as the army and military personnel in Vietnam. So she's healing these people, and she doesn't really consider race or color. She's just doing her job as a registered nurse. So as the story progresses, we learn of this old man called XE. He's one of these Vietnamese civilians. He happens to be a holy man, so he's wholly revered in the Vietnamese community, and he's seen as some kind of healer. But Kitty, Lieutenant Kitty, doesn't really think too much about that. She's just treating him like she would do any other of these horrific injuries that are happening within a hospital. So she makes a good friendship with the Vietnamese people, again, not really discriminating between the US soldiers or the Vietnamese civilians. And she befriends a lot of the Vietnamese patients in the hospital, one of which is this boy who's been amputated. One of his legs got amputated. So her involvement with this boy sort of leads her into doing some things which are not necessarily by the book. She sort of takes this boy and she finds herself in the wilderness of Vietnam, in the jungle, in this wonderful landscape that is Vietnam, and the atrocities that happen within that landscape as she learns to deal with this healing power of the land and the people in a rather fascinating fantasy twist to it as well, in a very enjoyable read by Elizabeth Anne Scarborough. So what is there to like in The Healer's War by Elizabeth Anne Scarborough? Look, for me, it's got to be that different view on the Vietnam War, right? We're so used to seeing the soldier's view, but rarely do you see a movie or read a book that talks to these registered nurses, these people in these hospitals dealing with terrible injuries and just doing the humanitarian thing. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that different view that we have in this novel, and I also really enjoyed Elizabeth Anne Scarborough's writing. It's very believable, this story, right? And that's no surprise given that she is a Vietnam vet, so she's been there, she's done this, and it translates into what is a very raw and sometimes emotional and powerful narrative of this Vietnam War. So I really did enjoy that. It sort of, to be honest, took me a bit off guard. I wasn't expecting that, but it really is a wonderful piece of writing that does really show the horrors of these wars. I've hinted at in my plot overview that this in some ways also feels very autobiographical, right? The writing sort of lends itself to that. So many times as I was reading the story of this main protagonist, Lieutenant Kitty, I kept thinking Elizabeth Anne Scarborough in my head, right? It's just that very raw, very personal experience that is, for me, in many ways, autobiographical. I just really enjoyed that aspect of the novel. The other thing I really enjoyed is there's a lot of medical procedures. I wouldn't say a lot, but there is definitely a fair few medical procedures that happen in this novel. And what I enjoyed about it is that it gave you enough information to understand, the pain and the suffering that some of these people may have been going through and how they were treated with terms that there were scientific and medical terms that didn't necessarily fly over your head, right? I just really liked the balance that she had there with some of these procedures that again lends itself to being a very authentic, very believable narrative. So I did enjoy that as well. What is there not to like in The Healer's War by Elizabeth Anne Scarborough? Look, I'd have to say I rank these novels on the Sci-Fi share ladder on their merits around the concept and execution when it comes to science fiction or fantasy themes. And I've got to say that there's really not much fantasy in this novel at all. There's really not. It's a 300 odd page book. Let me just double check that for you. Yeah, just bang on, 300-page book, right? And there's no hint of fantasy until at least page 150. And when that does happen, I can't help but feel that it felt forced. The fantasy elements in this novel just felt forced to me. And I would have to say that it just detracted from my enjoyment of the novel, which is sort of odd, right? Given what we do on the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder. But I'd have to say that I would have enjoyed this novel if it was just straight out fiction, omitting rather that fantasy element, because I just don't see it adding anything to the plot at all. I honestly feel that if you took that magic out of the equation, it wouldn't have changed the plot or my enjoyment at all, and including it had the opposite effect. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I can't recommend this one to science fiction or fantasy fans. I think the little fantasy that is in here actually took away from my enjoyment. So I can't recommend it to you guys unless you're looking to branch out into different areas. But who would I recommend it to? Because I still thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would say it's still a very good read, but don't come in expecting to see or read a fantastic fantasy novel, because it just was not that for me. But if you're looking to get a different perspective on what the Vietnam War was like, viewed different from what you see in the front lines with the soldiers and the military services, I think this just is a wonderful story about those supporting crew, right? The people behind the scenes in roles like the nurses, like the doctors, like the radio operators, or the people that were behind the front lines. So for that, I would say, yeah, have a go at The Healer's War. You may be pleasantly surprised. I thoroughly enjoyed it. When it comes to the memory test, look, The Healer's War I do remember it. I do remember it as being that view of this nurse in Vietnam War, and I almost remember it as an biography, I should say. And sometimes I wonder if it should have just been that, or just a piece of fiction, right? So I would say, yeah, it held up to the memory test. But when it comes to those magical themes and the magic within this, or the fantasy themes, I couldn't remember any of that. And like I said many times now, it detracted from my enjoyment. So yeah, highly recommended. It is a memorable novel, but not necessarily a memorable fantasy novel. When it comes to similar books that we've covered today on The Shed, if you've enjoyed books like Slow River, this is not a war book, but I sort of saw similarities in here as well, right? Where it's not really a fantasy novel, or it's not really a science fiction novel, but it's just a decent piece of fiction. I would say if you've enjoyed Slow River and that sort of, you don't mind the little science or science fiction or a little bit of fantasy, then I'd say have a go at The Healer's War, because as I was reading it, this sort of did come to mind, thinking it's a very similar novel as far as the execution of a very basic concept. The other one that comes to mind is Pat Murphy's The Falling Woman. I seem to be coming across this a fair few times lately, but again, because this one was also a very similar novel, right, where it was really a book about relationships between this daughter and her mother, and how they had to reconcile, which wasn't a strong fantasy theme. The fantasy elements were there, but did they really add to the story? Again, similar kind of vibes. But if you didn't mind Pat Murphy's the Falling Woman, and you enjoyed that very light sort of fantasy themes, again, I think you're going to enjoy The Healer's War for different reasons, but again, just light on fantasy themes. We've got to rank it on our ever-growing Sci-Fi share ladder. Let me flip the cameras around and see where this one lands. So back to the Sci-Fi share ladder and ranking today's 1989 Nebula award-winning novel by Elizabeth Anne Scarborough, The Healer's War. So I've got my full criteria down below that I use to, rank these wonderful novels. But when it comes to the concept in this one, I'd say that I enjoyed the concept, right? Taking that Vietnam War, a registered nurse's view of that war, dealing with the atrocities of war. But I felt the execution lacked a little, right? I just didn't see the fantasy themes working, and at times I felt forced. And I think it was like she wanted to tell this story and she just forced that fantasy theme into it that I just didn't really enjoy it. So I lost quite a couple of marks when it comes to the execution. I'd have to say that also the characters, I did enjoy Lieutenant Kitty there. She was okay, but I've got to say that it didn't quite do it for me as well. The characters were not very memorable, and I didn't really feel connected to them, but I did see the war through their eyes. So it was a sort of a mixed bag when it comes to the characters. When it comes to the plot was also middle of the range there. It wasn't a bad plot, but sometimes I just, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed that Vietnam. I thought she did a wonderful job of painting that scene. But the plot didn't really have me engaged. Like, it just, she was going through this journey through the jungle, and I got that, but it was mediocre, as was the ending, and as was the writing itself. Which is not to say it was bad, or I'm ranking these against all the other great novels on this list. So the writing, I said, is in the middle there somewhere, as was the plot, when compared to all these other wonderful novels, right? So it's still a decent plot, decent characters, decent ending, but somewhere in the middle when it comes to the actual experience here. When it comes to the memory test, this one, look, there wasn't much I really record apart from that Healer's War being a novel about this registered nurse in Vietnam. But I really didn't remember much of the journey that she took into the jungle. I couldn't remember why. I couldn't remember anything of the ending at all, right? Which is not a bad ending, by the way, when it comes to the criteria. The ending, I think I gave it a 2.5 as well. So the ending was okay, but it wasn't memorable. So it got a 1 for the memory test. It really didn't quite have what it took against all these other great novels in the rank. In the recommendation sections, I made hints of books like Slow River and Falling Woman. And I think it's going to be somewhere around there when it comes to this novel. And I've had a good, long, hard think about this already. So I'm going to move the book out of the way. And without further ado, I'm going to place The Healer's War just above The Falling Woman and Slow River. Because I think when it comes to the story, it's a very raw and emotional view, like I mentioned, when it comes to that Vietnam War and her experiences. So for that, I'm going to say it was better than The Falling Woman and Slow River. So it's somewhere towards the bottom of the seaside here, but definitely a worthwhile novel and one that I think deserves a Nebula. Have you read The Healer's War by Elizabeth Anne Scarborough? Have you read? This is the only novel of hers I've ever read. I haven't read any of her other fantasy novels. So it'll be interesting to get your feedback as to, have you read her other work? Would you say it's better or worse than The Healer's War? Are there any other books of hers that you would recommend to a fantasy or a science fiction fan? I'd love to hear your comments, as I'm sure some of the viewers would as well, because it's an interesting one. I definitely saw some greatness in her writing and really interesting themes. So interesting to see what else she's done in the past. Hey, that was it. It's getting a bit muggy in here as always on a summer day, but I thank you for your time and your patience as I struggle my way through the Sci-Fi shed ladder, and I'll see you next time in the shed.